We are now really in the home stretch of this free school, which is run since last spring. And it has really, I think, provided an interesting opportunity for us to think about the experience of 20th century fascism, and then also to consider the rise of authoritarianism in the 21st century. Alex Belescu is somebody who we've known for a couple of years now and has already spoken at the Institute on, I think, at least one occasion, maybe more. 2 occasions, yes. And has also participated from the audience in a very direct and robust way, some very good interventions. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce him this evening. He is currently an ethnographer with Vancouver Coastal Health. He's also an adjunct professor in urban studies at SFU. And he is from Romania, which is important for understanding the nature of his talk this evening, because I think in part it will center on the televised fall of the Ceausescu regime in part. And the title of his talk this evening is the Aesthetics of Totalitarian Salvation. So please join me in welcoming Alex Belescu.
Good evening again, and thank you, Samir, for the generous introduction. You captured probably a fifth of my life, as I lived in 6 other countries, and I don't know how it happened, but it was not only Romania as a totalitarian regime that I've visited. I spent 10 months in Iran and 3 years in Turkey, and I moved in 2014 here in Vancouver. And in between there was California, where I did my school, and that's another type of totalitarianism. Now, I'm going to talk about the aesthetics of totalitarian salvation. You will not hear fascism in my talk tonight, because I'm trying to talk about something else, maybe not even post-fascism, maybe something that it precedes and goes beyond fascism. So in 1989, the history was about to end, an end marked by the beginning of the history as reality show. As Agamben was keen to observe, the Romanian regime change and the televised execution of Ceausescu coupled with the on-air revolution, constituted the dramatic stage entry of the staged reality in becoming. So the revolution looked like this. Most of the revolutionary fervor happened in the studio, and it was instilled via airwaves to the population following discourses that seemed spontaneous by men who later became prominent holders of power in post-Ceausescu Romania. Only in that picture you can see future senators, the director of the National Theatre Museum, who is still director of the National Theatre Museum after 25, 30 years, and so on. A little reversed engineering would easily reestablish the stage character of the spontaneous addresses to the people. At 15, I was an extra in the show, and I remember vividly how I quickly left the larger set of the streets when one of the speakers at the balcony, the mic was up for grabs, received the loudest ovations when he celebrated the newly acquired liberty by reminding the people that we will be able to see the European Football Championship live on TV, or even travel to see the games. Little did he know the free movement referred to commodities and finance and not to human beings. To his credit, He was vividly embarrassed after first trying to steer the excitement with cultural references. Museums, freedom to travel to see the museums was top of the list. But before watching with docile fury the victories and failures of the Romanian national soccer team on the international stage, other images triggered the instant rage of the spectators and served to momentarily, and for some permanently, justify the summary execution of the Romanian dictatorial couple, the interiors of the residence. And not so much any interiors, but the bathrooms with gold-plated appliances. Does it remind you of anything? My first moment of recognition was in fact in Southern California, when I visited the Trinity Broadcast Center in late 90s. And Trinity Broadcast Center, it's a fundamentalist Christian broadcast center. But you see, my anthropological curiosity knows no bounds. It looks like this. It's between freeways. The architecture and space design had an uncanny resemblance with the House of the People as Ceausescu's monster building is known. And it is of utmost importance to experience the space from inside in order to understand the effects of its layout. The references are clearly extracted from Versailles. We will get back to this later. And they have other contemporary correspondences. I'm not telling you what it is. I leave it up to you to identify this image. However, it is the interiors that reminded me the most of the recent history in Romania, with a twist. What was abhorrent to the newly liberated people of Romania was desirable and worthy of emulation for the born free people of the United States. This is Trinity Broadcast Center. It was only after that that I discovered Kurt Vonnegut and reread Max Weber, beginning thus a path of understanding. My question tonight is, what generates this display of worldly possession, and how and if they are related with a totalitarian view of the world? Is this the expression of heavenly salvation? Salvation from what? And who will be there to lead us on the heavenly stairways? I guess it won't be Robert Plant. Let us leave it generic. The providential leader, a prophet-like figure that commands love from the people. In fact, this explains the obsession of being the most loved by everybody. And we hear this phrase under different forms from all those in power who believe their power is or should be limitless. Longer they stay in power, more the narcissism turns murderous, as there's never enough proof for the love they demand. My thesis is that nationalism and populism do propose a path of salvation, a salvation from dependency translated in depth, and we'll see later why, and restoration of an autarkic state resonant with the libertarian ideology, or more so, with a more ingrained, sedentary, farming type of patriarchalism. This path is meant to pave the way to self-determination as the practical expression of the construction of that very self. That self, the self of the sovereign nation, is strong, has the characteristics of property-bearing individual, it owns itself and its destiny, and above all, it is pure. Impurity is equated with danger, and I would refer here to Mary Douglas' seminal work, Purity and Danger. In general, the underlying principle of cleanness is that they shall conform fully to their class. Those, brackets, are unclean which are imperfect members of their class, or whose class itself confounds the general scheme of the world. Mary Douglas goes on to argue that impurity represents danger as it menaces the rigid order of the world. Those who are impure in a system of categories will be deemed dangerous. This passage extracted here refers to Leviticus and food impurity. The brackets mean in turn animals and species. In what I prefer to call the nationalist disorder of things, we can replace animals with humans and species with ethnic, religious, racial, or any other type of prevalent category. Thus, our code becomes, in general, the underlying principle of cleanliness in humans is that they shall conform to their class. Those groups who are unclean, which are imperfect members of their class, or whose class itself confounds the general scheme of the world. I'll move to sovereign nations and the idea of sovereignty. Strong sovereign nations let their people take ownership of the future and control their own destiny. This is a quote. I'll give you another quote. Life demonstrates that we must act with full determination in order to assert, in the relationship between states, the principles of full equality of rights, respect for sovereignty and national independence, non-interference in internal affairs, renunciation of force and of threatening with force. And another quote, here we see an attack against the state's sovereignty rights. There cannot be such an attack on countries' sovereignty rights in international law. I'm not sure you recognize to whom those speeches belong. Two of the three speeches are of people currently leading powerful regional or global powers, while the third one belonged to a dead dictator, not Hitler. What matters at this point is not necessarily the owner of the speech, but the function of the ideas they transmit. And I quote from Maltz, the ex-deputy chief of staff to former UN ambassador Samantha Power. Sovereignty is the shield that many governments use at the UN to defend against accusation of abuse. When governments face criticism over imprisonment of dissidents or persecution of minorities or even sexual abuse by their peacekeepers on UN missions, they routinely cite sovereignty as the overriding concern and justification. Purity and the sovereignty of the pure secures thus an arbitrary and yet legitimate power over the impure without external checks. Now we must remember one thing: gold is sought for and valued by its purity. One of the important roadblocks in attaining the state of blessed autarky is debt, not only because it creates a state of interdependency with a creditor, but also because debt itself has a religious undertone, and while under debt, one cannot be saved. As Graeber observes in depth the first 5,000 years, since creditor and debtor are ultimately equals, if the debtor cannot do what it takes to restore herself to equality, there is obviously something wrong with her. It must be her fault. This connection becomes clear if we look at the etymology of common words for debt in European language. Many are synonyms for fault, sin, or guilt. Just as a criminal owes a debt to society, a debtor is always a sort of criminal. This has very interesting implication beyond our conversation if we push the phrase to its logical conclusion. Societies organized on credit find it easier to criminalize their citizens. Let's go back. In other words, the monetary debt is a secular manifestation of sin. This may explain the obsession of totalitarian figures to be free of debt. This, and of course, the sovereignty. And the recent independence campaigns in Europe, Brexit leading the way, that stress monetary calculation, misrepresented, but who cares in the alternative truth era, over the political and practical concerns. One can always choose to represent oneself as free of debt as a political achievement, because this state is pure, free of sin, and worthy of salvation. The saving figure is the leader who will free us from debt. This is where things get really complicated, because there is an undeniable crossover between left ideals and the rhetoric of nationalized sovereignty, in the sense that the ideologues of new independentist movements keep the left ideals of a strong state responsible for the well-being of its citizens and add a nationalist flavor to it. It happened before. And we must remember that in between the wars, one of the generators of Nazism in Germany was the high indebtedness after the First World War. In fact, here we may touch the demographic limits of politics. How does the definition of the size of the political sphere influences the shifting of ideologies? Ideologies are resting on fault lines defined by context. When they move, the same ideology easily slips and changes. Let's go back to gold. If we have enough, not only we pay our debts and become free, strong, and great again, but we can also use its surplus for decoration purposes. And this is from the person who wants to make America great again. One fascinating detail about the decorations of Trump's penthouse, pictured here, is that it's his first wife, Ivana Trump, who claims credit for it. She does it in her book, Raising Trump. It's an interesting book, she just came out. She also infuses a dose of humor in her claim by saying this is how Louis XVI would have lived if he had had the money. Now, Megan Garber in The Atlantic does a review of the book, and I'm going to quote from her some interesting detail of Ivana Trump biography. Ivana Trump, née Ivana Zelničková, was born in Czechoslovakia just after the Iron Curtain went down, the only child in a family rich in love and poor in most everything else. The Zelničeks were not party members. The only chance they had of advancing their daughter rights was to keep their heads down and work and work and work some more. Being less than the best was simply not an option. Because, in a very real way, one mistake could doom your life, Ivana recalls. She adds, we couldn't be sure who to trust outside the family. End of the quote. This upbringing, although not Protestant, does instill the conviction that success and wealth equivalates moral superiority, and the reverse. That is, if you're not successful or wealthy, you must be morally inferior. More so, what's there to be retained is the narrowness of the circle of trust, nobody outside family. Does this explain, at least partially, the current White House administration composition? Should we extend this to clan, tribe, race? The seeds are all there. Since the last king of France before the French Revolution and his style is in discussion, let's think again Versailles, outlandish style, and Louis XVI predecessor, Louis XV. Let's do it via the Man of the Year 2016 by Time magazine. In his article, Time Cover is a Subversive Work of Art, appeared in Forward.com, Jake Rom does a wonderful analysis of this image, from the position on the chair to the position of the camera and passing through the red horns drawn by the letter M. That I will not reproduce here. However, the chair, more so than its occupant, commands attention. And I quote, the masterstroke, the single detail that completes the entire image, is the chair. Trump is seated in what looks to be a vintage Louis XV chair, Louis XV chair, so named because it was designed in France under the reign of King Louis XV in the middle of 18th century. The chair not only suggests the blindly ostentatious reigns of the French kings just before the revolution, but also more specifically the reign of Louis XV, who, according to historian Norman Davies, paid more attention to hunting women and stags than to governing the country, and whose reign was marked by debilitating stagnation, recurrent wars, and perpetual financial crisis. Also, you can note that the chair is a little bit broken. Another interesting detail. I would argue that those lavish decorations and marks of excess are signs of reaching a state of grace for a certain type of sensibility, the autarkic sensibility that fears interdependency. The middle ground, the equilibrium that fears excess, has an instant rejection of this representation as mauvais goût. And probably a lot of us felt it when we saw that. In fact, the taste of excess. However, those representations do touch the sensibilities of the disenfranchised, who may dream of salvation in very earthly material terms. And maybe, just maybe, what I thought was the Romanian disgust towards excesses of Ceausescu was in fact envy. A critique of these dreams we may find, of course, in Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. There is a figure there that fascinates many commentators, depicting a pit in which some unknown being is defecated golden coins. But what if the pit is also golden plated? The delight is supreme, or should I say absolute. Those dreams and their expressions are not to be taken lightly, and this is instead of a conclusion, a working conclusion. Those dreams and their expressions are not to be taken lightly or in derision. I'm so thirsty. They do express desire for something that we cannot fathom, and maybe we cannot do it because we, the relatively privileged, already live in Bosch's garden. More than 20 years ago, in 1994, Isaiah Berlin received the title of Doctor of Laws from University of Toronto. I quote from his speech. If you are truly convinced that there is some solution to all human problems, that one can conceive an ideal society which man can reach if only they do what is necessary to attain it, then you and your followers must believe that no price can be too high to pay in order to open the gates of such a paradise. The moral demarcation and righteous blaming may have little political effect in the democratic system, absent awareness of Popper's paradox of tolerance, because in its eternal logic, extremism is both morally coherent and morally superior as any other type of religious system. Furthermore, for many, it appears to embody the moralness itself. Unless we understand the dreams of salvation of the disenfranchised and the bottomless pit of desire that consumerism offers in exchange of dignity, we won't be able to save ourselves from a totalitarian dream or another. Again, in Isaiah Berlin's words, the search for a single overarching ideal, because it is the one and the only truth for one humanity, invariably leads to coercion, and then to destruction, blood, eggs are broken, but the omelette is not inside. There is only an infinite number of eggs, human lives, ready for the breaking. And in the end, the passionate idealists forget the omelette and just go on breaking eggs. Thank you.